For this lesson, I want to talk about the distributive property, and this is a way to multiply something into a set of parentheses. So for something of the form a times b plus c, we can take a and multiply it to both b and c, giving us a times b. There was a plus sign in the middle, so plus a times c. So let's try an example 1 here, where I'm going to multiply in part a 8 to both x and 2y using this property. So that is 8 gets multiplied to x and it gets multiplied to 2y. I'll write it out carefully with some parentheses, but this is 8 times the first thing, which I'll put as x, plus 8 times the second thing, which is 2y. And really the last thing to do is just simplify anything that appears. And, well, 8 times x we can just write as 8x. The parentheses aren't necessary. But for 8 times 2y, we can multiply the numbers together, 8 and 2, which give us 16, and then write the y next to it. So here's a direct way to apply the distributive property, and we can't simplify it any further. So for b, obviously the number that gets multiplied in can be a little bit more complicated, like here, a negative number. So negative 3 is going to be multiplied to both terms. And I like to ask whether the value is going to be positive or negative after we write it. So if we start with negative 3 times a negative, well, it's 8x, I'm just going to write that it's positive. You don't actually have to put the plus sign, so I'm just going to put this is 3 times 8x. I know I have two negatives being multiplied, so it is positive. Now for the second piece, it's a negative times a positive, so I'm just going to put a negative and then write 3 times 7. So if some negatives appear, just ask yourself if you think the result will be a positive one or a negative one. Now, just like in the last example, I'll look at the first set of terms being multiplied. So we have 8 and 3, which that's going to multiply to 24, and I have x left over. And then I'm subtracting just 3 times 7, which is 21, and that is it. So for part C, really similar to part B, same idea, but now both terms inside the parentheses are negative. So to start with, we'll have, it's two negatives, so it's positive, and we should have just 3 times 9. For the second piece, okay, again, we have a negative times a negative, so I'm just going to write positive. I'll place the 3 and write the 6y. Combining all of this together, we have 3 times 9, which is 27, plus 6 times 3, which is 18, and there's a y as well. For example 2, same idea, using the property, the distributive property, to multiply something into a set of parentheses, but for the 3 that appear here, it's going to be slightly more complicated. So for part A, the difference here is, well, we don't just have 2 terms anymore, there's this third one here. But this property says that you can multiply as long as you multiply to every single term inside the parentheses. So let's write this one out. So it's going to be negative, and I'll put 0.5 times 10x. It's then going to be positive 0.5 times 20y, but we just keep going until we get to the very last term. So this now is going to be negative, and we get 0.5 times 2. So there could be 3, 4, 5 terms, however many, you would just multiply to every single one of those terms. To simplify this, it's going to be negative. 0.5 times 10 is 5, and then we have x. For the second term, it's going to be plus 0.5 times 20 is going to be 10, and then I copy down the y. The last term is going to be negative 0.5 times 2, and that is 1. All right, so for part B, really similar. We now have 3 terms, but the number outside is a fraction. So it gets multiplied to the 3 terms in the parentheses. But I think to be careful with this one, I'll write 2/3, And then maybe write the second part as 27a over 1. And you can use parentheses if you'd like to, but the fact that there are two separate fractions kind of imply that we're multiplying one fraction to another. If I continue this, I get minus 2/3 times, I'll write 18b over 1, and then plus 2/3 times 3/4. So written in this way, I now know how to cancel any common factors between the numerators and the denominators. So let's see. For my very first term, I have 3 goes into itself once and it goes into 27 9 times. The number that's left over is going to be 2 times 9, which is 18. It's divided by 1, which I don't need to write, and I can just place the a, the variable, at the very end. So we continue. We have minus. Okay, again, we have 3 goes into itself once. It goes into 18 6 times. There's nothing else that can be canceled. That's 2 times 6, which is 12, divided by 1, which I won't write, and I'll place the variable b at the very end. Then I'll have plus, looking at my last term, the 3's cancel. 2 goes into itself once. It goes into 4 2 times. We do have a fraction left over this time. The numerator is going to be 1. The denominator is going to be 2. And I think it's fine to leave it just like this as plus 1/2 at the very end. We can't simplify this further, and that's the final answer for part B. Again, building here for part C, same idea, but now I have a variable outside of the parentheses. It's not just a number, but it also has an x attached to it. So for this part, I think we're going to have to use maybe some rules of exponents. 2x gets multiplied to the 3 terms inside the parentheses. So let's see. We get 2x times 4x minus 2x times 5y plus 2x, I'll write times 1. So for the first term here, I can break this into 2 parts where it's going to be 2 times 4, and that gives me 8. Maybe I'll be careful here. I'm going to write down, well, there's 2 x's, so I could just write, well, x times x and deal with it later. And let's keep going. We'll come back to that to maybe simplify it further. So we'll have minus, so we have 2 and 5, which gives me 10. Again, copying down, there was 1x and 1y. And then at the very end, we have 2x times 1. 1 doesn't change anything if you multiply by it, so I just get 2x. You could have done that right at the start. And I guess to complete this, an x times a y, you can't do anything with that. That's simplified. But this, we have an x to the first times an x to the first. And by our rules of exponents, I'm going to write this as 8 times x squared. That's our way of saying you have 2 x's. Minus 10xy plus 2x. And we've completely multiplied and simplified as far as possible. And so that's the final answer. For the last example here, there's one point of confusion that can happen when using the distributive property. You can multiply on either the left side or the right side. So here the a is now on the right side of this set of parentheses, but you can still multiply that in even if it appears on the right as opposed to the left. You still get 2 terms. You get, well, I'll write it as b times a and c times a, but it really works the same way. Where the confusion can come in is if you have 2 different expressions. Here's 2x plus 1, and then there's this minus 3 at the end. And it looks really similar to the one that appears here. The only difference is there are no parentheses here, and there are parentheses here. These 2 expressions mean 2 very different things. I'm going to start with this one. And here you can apply the distributive property to it. So here's what that would look like. If you have 2x plus 1, here we're saying you're multiplying by -3, so that's the reason for the set of parentheses. you use this property whenever you are multiplying. So you can take this negative 3 and multiply it into the parentheses. This gives us 2x times negative 3 plus 1 times negative 3. And if we simplify, okay, we get 2 times negative 3, that's negative 6x. I could have noted that the second term is going to be negative, but it's okay to do that last, and we have minus 3. So here was applying the distributive property, but on the right, I was allowed to do that because I was definitely multiplying. If you compare that to 2x plus 1 minus 3, the fact that there's no parentheses here means you're not multiplying. This means you are subtracting 3. So maybe I'll just draw a line here to indicate we're doing two different problems. So this is missing. So therefore, I could really think of this problem as just 2x plus 1. The parentheses were not necessary there. And then at the very end, there's minus 3 left over. When this simplifies, you have 2x, but you have 1 minus 3, which is negative 2. So the point of this is there's two different ways to use the distributive property, but you have to make sure to use it, you are in fact multiplying. So for this expression, the extra parentheses meant we were definitely multiplying. Here, this just means subtraction because there are no parentheses.